So we're now going to move on to hear and see a presentation from Andy Begley, the Chief Executive Officer of Shropshire County Council, and then we're going to have a bit of a Q&A with Andy. Andy has a background in before he became Chief Exec of social care within Shropshire and elsewhere, and I'm delighted to introduce his presentation.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today at the conference. It's a fantastic opportunity. As many people will know, this is a subject that's close to my heart and an agenda that I've been involved with for a number of years now. So in good presentation style and format, I'll tell you what I'm going to tell you. So to start with, I'd like to try and explain, or ultimately, the ultimate aim of this presentation will be to explain the title. I thought it would be helpful if I shared some of my own personal reflections on my journey through this agenda over the past few years that might just help with clarify understanding and certainly help me to clarify my thoughts around this particular subject area. And then I'd like to finish off with really that positive challenge and perhaps that kind of call to arms. So, and where we've got a short amount of time, so let's crack on.
Data.
Really positive data.
The full data.
The data.
We're looking at the data.
Early data.
Some encouraging data, following the data.
Unless we give up our personal data.
The data, you don't...
The data.
The data is going to be key in the weeks ahead.
Data, there's our data. We'll see data, all of the data.
Effectiveness data.
The data.
More data on that soon.
Crunched all the data yet.
Because these are complicated figures to look at.
So you might have noticed then that data is particularly on trend at the moment. It's something that everybody's talking about. But interestingly, it's something that I fear means different things to different people. People talk about big data all the time. They talk about analytics. They talk about artificial intelligence, algorithms, data sets, data mining. So really, there's 1,001 buzzwords around this particular agenda. But as I say, my fear is it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to everybody. So actually, one of my favourite quotes about big data is from a behavioural economist, Dan Ariely, where he compares big data to teenage sex, and this is what he says. Everybody's talking about it. Nobody really knows how to do it. Everybody thinks everyone else is doing it, so everyone else claims they're doing it. But for me, what does that really mean? I think this is about people get enthralled with data. They start to look at the minutiae, they look at the detail, and they're kind of searching for the next piece of data, when actually they're probably asking the wrong kind of question. It's about how do we use individual data sets to look at the big picture? How do we create those pockets of data, bring them together, and it demonstrates something else for us? And here's an example of what 10,000 different pieces of data, or in this example, photographs from NASA, look like when they're put together. And incidentally, that piece was created by a local company here in Shropshire, and that's one of the organisations that we've been working with locally to build this kind of cohort of digital capability and entrepreneurship, I suppose, around this agenda. I thought also at this point it might be useful just to share my reflections on my journey of understanding around this agenda and what that's looked like over the past few years. I guess I started off a few years ago talking about healthcare and telecare, and we all talked about the big grey boxes and big red buttons, and then immediately my interest was diverted to the shinier bits of kit and equipment, to the technical innovation in this space, and then quickly moved from kit onto the data, the intelligence, data mining, process re-engineering, and then subsequently onto data visualization, looking at new and fairly innovative ways that we could show data and how we communicate information, how we communicate that intelligence that we gain from looking at data in really new ways. And that's proved really fertile ground over the past months and years. And paradoxically, that's kind of led to the point where the barriers around data sharing and our understanding of how we can legitimately share data for the right kind of purposes. And there's a lot of noise locally and nationally around this all the time. There's challenge put into place all the time. The tabloids are always keen to kind of exploit the big brother kind of agenda. And for me, I find that intriguing and frustrating in equal amounts. You think about every time you interact with Google, you touch the keyboard, you've relinquished all your responsibility around your personal data. When you go to Tesco, you accept that probably Tesco holds more information about you than your GP does. All that is deemed okay by society. Yet, if I suggest we might want to overlay a couple of data sets to try and save somebody's life, then people get very energized and aggrieved at that. So that remains a key challenge for us all as a system going forwards. The point that I made at a conference a few years ago now was really keeping this simple and understanding that what the capabilities are around just putting a couple of different data sets together and the impact that could have on people's lives.
Event like this, when we're talking about big data, we're talking about analytics, we're talking about all the technological advances that we're aware of. What I'm trying to show with this slide is just by aligning 3 particular data sets, I just want to demonstrate the sort of outcomes that we can achieve. All this complexity, all this data, we can still do something very, very simple with 3 little data sets. When we start to consider how we use artificial intelligence and machine learning, we start to crunch through thousands of data sets, hundreds of thousands of data sets. I hope you can see the potential for this. But this is a kind of a working example. We talk about tech and we talk about all the good that it can do. At the end of the day, this is about Dave. It's about us finding Dave before Dave finds us. Early intervention and prevention, that's what it's about. And all this is about people and their outcomes.
So I think the point I made there in the video is probably holds fast today, and is probably almost more relevant today and for tomorrow's agenda in terms of making sure that we're using data to identify individuals and to really humanize the system, make sure that we understand what the focus is, what our objectives are. So if we think about tomorrow's agenda, what do we know about tomorrow? Well, I guess nobody's got a crystal ball and can say for certain, but what we can work on are things that we do know for now. So we do know that as we move out of a response and recovery phase of COVID, we start to feel the legacy impacts of the pandemic on our economy, on our national infrastructure, on our employment, and what that's really going to look like. We can be fairly certain employment rates will increase. We can be fairly certain there will be a reduction in public sector funding as austerity 2.0 comes into play. We could be fairly certain that this will have a negative impact on mental health issues and perhaps more concerningly generally on wider population health issues. So all these things we know at the moment. So then it becomes incumbent upon us to decide what we need to do to address those new demands, to address those new conditions. And where do we start with a challenge like that? My view is perhaps we think about what did we do last time? And I guess the last major epidemic that was felt in this country was 1918, the Spanish flu. What did we do as a result of that? How did we react as a nation? And a lot of that was centered around local capability and local resilience as opposed to national directives. If we think about what happened post World War II, within the UK, we had the construction of the NHS during and after that particular period. We had renewed infrastructure, we had renewed initiatives around housing. All these are different approaches and opportunities post a pandemic or post a crisis environment. So this time around, we can think about how we can use different approaches, learn from the past, learn from the more recent past and those innovations in data and technology, so that we can apply that thinking and make sure that we're pinpointing our resources as effectively as possible to find the people we need to support, and then to look at new and innovative ways of supporting them. And if we as individuals think about those little changes that we can make, what happens when we start to think of things as a system, both locally, regionally, nationally, and how we can change and align our collective resources to those requirements of the future of a post-COVID environment. My concern is if we don't concentrate on the right things, in this case, people, if we don't humanize that data and technology system, then we're in danger that big data will in fact end up looking like a broken pencil and we will miss the point. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. That's a fantastic presentation and had us all, very engaged in the points that you were making. So it strikes me that you paint a picture of what data could do, but you also give a warning, really, that rather like your metaphor about teenage sex, we can make this something that it isn't if we're not careful, and that it can be a broken pencil. So can I just ask you then, do you feel optimistic about the future, Andy? And in order to be optimistic, what would be the couple of things that you would think are essential for people to pay attention to, either nationally or locally?
I think in a strange way to answer that question is yes, I am optimistic, actually. I think in this post-crisis environment, and that's the horizon that I guess I'm focusing on now. We talk about how we're in a response period around COVID and how we'll move into a recovery period. But I think beyond then, I'm talking about the real legacy impacts of COVID. So that horizon then has got to be beyond 18 months, 2 years, and as James said previously, the next maybe 10 years. And when you think about the opportunities that lay ahead of us, I think they're incredible. The speed at which this agenda has developed and accelerated over the past 12 months is incredible. We've achieved so much, and more importantly, I think we've demonstrated the capability around tech and around data. So for those people that weren't entirely convinced and thought it was something a little bit futuristic, I think they're entirely convinced by that now. And the fact that we operate within this real world context where the development of data, intel, tech, connectivity is just accelerating and accelerating. And so really there's a plethora of opportunity out there. The point, to answer the second part of the question, I think what we really need to do is focus. Because as I kind of alluded to, I often feel like a kid in a sweet shop in terms of looking at all these opportunities and the next shiny thing, the next piece of data I could use and bring together. So I think it's about focusing on what it is we're trying to achieve. I think James used the phrase understanding our ambition. I think it's a great phrase. Let's really understand what we're trying to achieve. In simple terms, I think all of us in local government particularly are just looking at the whole equation of supply and demand. And what we're trying to do is manage that balance. We've done lots over the past 10 years, probably too much on the supply side in terms of shrinking that, in terms of making that as efficient as possible. When we start to think about demand, that becomes a much bigger picture when you think of that post-COVID environment. So we've got to use data, understand the population, and understand where we can pinpoint our scarce resources to have the greatest impact, which to me means using information and intelligence to get further and further upstream so that ultimately people avoid our services altogether.
Thank you, Andy. And can you think of any kind of examples in the last, well, recently or otherwise, where you think you or other people have got this right? An example of that you could give the conference, which would be something that gives us people an understanding of what this might look like in practice if we really got this right.
So the example that I choose, and we're not quite there yet, but using this example was around how we can layer just a couple of data sets and think about them in a different way. And this was around thinking about the kind of data sets that councils use all the time. And we're sat on this data all the time, but to our shame, I don't think we join them up. I don't think we look at them comprehensively. So the idea that I often talk about was this idea that when somebody defaults on their council tax payments, Strangely, that's dealt with by a separate part of the organisation than social care, for example. So that disconnect causes serious issues. So a traditional response, far be it for me to suggest it would be our council, of course not, but I've heard elsewhere that local authorities, perhaps their response to default payment of council tax would be to send a couple of letters and then eventually send in legal services and ultimately bailiffs to try and recruit the position. And my point being, if we thought about that in a slightly different way, and the example I thought of is so a guy's a single parent looking after 2 children, and instead of sending him a few nasty letters, why don't you knock on his door and say, is everything okay? Because to me, non-payment of council tax is a fairly strong indicator something's going wrong in somebody's life. And so actually we could go in there and have a conversation, and you can imagine that the guy might be saying, hang on, council tax is the least of my problems. I've just lost my job. I can't afford the mortgage, not paying the council tax, and my boiler's just broken. And so something like that is really on the edge, on the cusp of losing an awful lot. Whereas if we go in there, have a different conversation, in this example, we could find support in terms of finding employment for somebody. We could contact mortgage providers and look for a mortgage holiday. We could defer council tax payments. And in terms of a broken boiler, bloody hell, can we not just put a boiler in? Would we not just support somebody to fix that issue? And suddenly you've put that person back on an even keel. And the upside is a much better outcome for that individual and their families. And ultimately it stops those individuals coming into contact with our services and us incurring those multiple costs throughout months and years of people being in contact with our services. So that was a whistle-stop way, but I hope that provides a kind of example you were looking for.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. And finally, we've got a question from Tim Coote. Thank you, Tim, for your question, which says, from a mathematical point of view, I worry about the impacts of large confidence intervals on how data can be used. Too many false positives waste money through unnecessary interventions, or fear from incorrect insights. Too many false negatives damage support through missed individuals in trouble. Getting the data together is relatively trivial based on experience in large-scale systems integration. Do you agree?
Well,
so I think the message here is actually it's a bit about well, it's already all very well getting the data together, but there's something about understanding how much you can trust it, how robust it is, and what you deduce from it and how you act on it, I think is the point that Tim is making.
I think that's right. And from experience, like many others over the past 12 months, I've spent hours and hours and hours on daily national calls around how we manage the pandemic and how we are reacting as a region or locally. And I've seen some of those national data sets, and I would agree, actually give all sorts of false indications. If we start to see it at too high a level, I think the point about some of the data and the examples I've given, they work really well. If they are, you get down to it's all about localities, it's about knowing your communities, and you define the size and area of those communities. Getting down to that level of detail, I think provides a level of assurance. I think you can get to that granularity really quite quickly, and then if you multiply back upwards, then from that detail and slowly step backwards, that's when I think you've got a higher level of confidence in the data you're looking at. And don't forget, the data is one thing, but we convert that into business intelligence, but it's the intelligence looking at the data that provides you with the business intelligence, if that makes sense. So knowing what questions to ask is really, really important. And I think this is where you've got to have that common sense approach. You've got to talk to people who use services. You've got to talk to people who understand services and service delivery, so that way you've got that holistic approach to data, and perhaps you're not just relying on the statistics and the machinery somewhere else to give you potentially information that's not triangulated in that way and sends you down a different path. Data is a huge agenda, and it's the rabbit warrens and places to go are all over the place. So I think it's trying to keep it as simple as possible. Again, going back to a previous expression, understand your ambition, understand your community, understand what it is you're looking to achieve.
Andy, thank you very much indeed. That was a really interesting presentation. Has given us some insights and some things to think about in terms of taking this issue forward and the use of data. And thank you for your time this morning and for what you're doing to continue to contribute to the development in this space. So thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure, thank you.